Well, I'll just get started by saying welcome. I'm Lowell Wise. I'm Executive Director of the Tacoma Tree Foundation, and this is part of our fall webinar series. So I'm really excited to be here and to be presenting on this topic. So thanks so much for your interest, and I wanted to let everyone know we are going to record this webinar and share it out in an edited form, lightly edited on YouTube. And hopefully you'll have a chance to share that later on if you enjoy the presentation today. This webinar is brought to all of you in part by Tacoma Creates, which funds our education program, and also by the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, which is supporting our work this fall on tree policy related issues in Pierce County. And so this is definitely relevant to that. We're really excited to be here and wanted to ask continued patience as we work through technical difficulties. The chat on this webinar is closed, but the way that you can ask a question anytime is on the Q&A section. Our presentation is going to be around a half an hour, and we'll definitely leave some time for questions at the end. So please use the Q&A on Zoom to ask questions, and I will help to moderate that. We want to acknowledge, as always, that we are resting on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, where they make their home and speak the Lushootseed language. And with that, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Mike Carey. Mike is the Urban Forest Program Manager at the City of Tacoma, and he is here to share with us about a project that he's been working on for quite a few years. Depends on how you count, I think. But I'm going to turn things over to Mike. And yeah, thanks so much for being with us, Mike. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Lowell. Thanks for having me here, and thanks everyone for tuning in to listen. I can't see how many folks are out there, but hopefully, as Lowell was saying, if other folks that you know are interested in this, you can always share around later. Also, at the very end, I'll kind of lead it off with there are some next steps too, opportunities for you to participate or tune in the near term as well. So hopefully, if you want, you're welcome to participate in that way. As Lowell mentioned, I've been working on this municipal code update project since about 2015-ish, in earnest, really picking up speed in 2019 with the adoption of the Urban Forest Management Plan, which I'll get into here in just a moment. And then in the last about 2 years, it's really gained some good traction. We've had a lot of really important discussions moving the content forward on this. And hopefully, if all goes well, knock on wood, we'll have something updated in the municipal code this year. So we're on the fast track here. So I'm going to try to figure out how to, there we go. Okay, so really quick overview of what I'll be talking about in today's presentation. I'll give a little bit of background and stage setting for the kind of the context of this municipal code update. What was on the table for discussion, what was off, kind of what all of the history, background, outreach, communications approach were to get to this point. And then I'll give a really brief overview of what's currently proposed in the municipal code update. And that's generally this content that you see here. It's going to be very truncated, very brief. So please recognize that if you want the actual details, you'll need to go into the draft ordinance document itself, which should be uploaded into the city's system soon. So if you go to the city council page, you'll be able to track through a Legistar is what it's called, but that's the kind of the web page that has all the uploaded documents. You should be able to find the actual code in there soon. And then I'll end it with some next steps and then open it up for a discussion. I don't know that I need to say this to this particular group, but I like to kick things off with, in general, what we lead with in the city is that trees are good. We understand that they have very significant impacts on our community for many, many reasons, right? They help to mitigate pollution, manage stormwater, reduce the urban heat, and those are three of the most important things that help direct a lot of our work in the urban forestry program. They also improve safety with our community. They can be tremendous traffic calming devices, for instance. They promote physical and mental well-being. They boost the economy and they help children learn. Recognizing this isn't a trees are good presentation, this is a tree code presentation. I just want to take a touch base on one of those points that I made, which is really about the urban heat island effect and how trees help to cool our communities. I think that was really exemplified in this last 2021 heat wave that we had, where we saw a spike in temperatures that we had not seen in a long time. It was 40 degrees hotter than average, and almost 2,800 heat-related emergency room visits happened, and at least 138 people died in Washington state alone. And this is just that Northwest heat wave that we had. From that, K and KX did a really informative 4-part series called Heated. And they spoke specifically about this heat wave all across the Puget Sound region in the Pacific Northwest. But then they dove into Tacoma specifically, and they helped to link historic redlining practices, disinvestment in certain communities, how all of those things impact tree canopy cover distribution, and then linking that to the urban heat island. And I'll just briefly say that of all of those deaths that were experienced in the Pacific Northwest, 8 heat-related deaths happened in Tacoma. And as you can see on this map, this is a map of our heat index during a heat wave in July 2018. You can see the locations where people passed away. And so we're actually able to link, it's not conceptual, right? We're linking people's health outcomes and the consequences of not having good tree canopy in certain areas of the city, the impacts to urban heat, and inability to insulate from the urban heat resulted in actual mortality of people, right? So this isn't conceptual, this is a real concern that we're dealing with as we get more extremes in heat. And we're gonna have to continue to grapple with that into the future. At the same time, we know that trees do a tremendous job of mitigating for some of those impacts, right? Trees can lower surface temperatures by a pretty significant rate. As much as 20 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is according to the EPA. Trees improve the air quality, lower greenhouse gas emissions, all those other great things too. But we know very directly that we've all experienced it on a hot summer day, right? We want to walk on that sidewalk that is underneath tree shade versus the one that doesn't have any tree shade, right? We can feel that. At the same time, as all of those things going on, we know those benefits of trees. It's well researched. We're seeing that. We know that in the Puget Sound region specifically, forests are declining. This is just one example of a study that was done by American Forests, published back in 1998, so it's a little dated. But over just a 24-year period of time, we saw high canopy decrease in the Puget Sound by 37%. The stormwater as a result of that increased by 29%, and the canopy loss would have removed 35 million pounds of pollutants annually, right? So this is this trend that's happening. Again, this analysis was over a 24-year period ending in 1996, and I haven't seen a good study that's happened in the same geographic area since then, but we would imagine that that trend is continuing on today. In the context of all that, right, so again, talking about Puget Sound as a region that's suffering from decline in urban forests, Tacoma specifically has been mapped for its tree canopy, right? And Tacoma's tree canopy right now, out of all the Puget Sound communities that have mapped their tree canopy, Tacoma is sitting in last place. We have the lowest tree canopy of any assessed community in the Puget Sound region. And that 20% that we have is about just over half of the national average for urban communities. So what have we done with all this information, right? So it's easy to get into a place where we say, okay, trees are good. Wow, trees are really declining fast in Puget Sound. Wow, Tacoma is in last place of all those communities. But there's something we can do about it, right? We can adopt policies, we can amend codes, we can help to hopefully change the trajectory for our future. And that's something that City Council has done. So we adopted a comprehensive plan element, which talks specifically about urban forestry, right? And I didn't include all of the different policy elements or different directives in these policy documents that I'm explaining here, just the ones that are specific to this code update that I'm here to talk about. But in the comprehensive plan, it says we should require BMPs and those industry standards and designing, planting, and maintaining trees in the right of way. We should retain as many mature trees as practical in the right of way and on city-owned property as well during the development process. The environmental action plan is another document that we've adopted, policy for the city. And within that, we specifically call out improving tree regulations for the right of way and private property. And then the urban forest management plan, which is kind of our main document that we use in the urban forestry program to kind of determine where our work is going to head between now and 2030. Specifically calling out again, updating TMC to align with a comprehensive plan, improving regulations and procedures to encourage tree preservation on private property and the right of way, and then adopting a heritage tree ordinance. So all of these things are kind of encompassed in this municipal code update. A little bit about the approach for this. So as I mentioned, in 2019, we adopted the Urban Forest Management Plan for the city of Tacoma, right? Which is kind of our policy document that helps to direct our work in urban forestry across the city between now and 2030. The process to adopt that, we started by conducting staff interviews. And again, it was a very big document for very many, or it was a lot of different things that were encompassed in there, but specific to the code update part of it that I'm here to talk about. We interviewed internal staff who administer our existing municipal code to figure out where are the pain points, what's not working well, how can we improve our level of service internally to our customers. We had a 2-year public engagement process where we held workshops and community surveys, and we had meetings with special interest groups and committees and commissions to figure out what are your needs and wants around, again, municipal code, which is a very fun subject to have community meetings about. But what would you like to see happen for a level of service in Tacoma? We also had a team of consultants do benchmarking research to figure out what are the trends across the industry all throughout the US, as well as in our region. And then how do we rank using this urban forest audit system that was developed by the US Forest Service? And that's kind of a ranking tool to see, do you have really progressive policies in place and procedures and the way that you deal with urban forestry, or are you kind of on the back end? And that showed some areas of improvement for Tacoma. All of this translated into this document that was adopted with the Urban Forest Management Plan called a pre-prospectus. So it's kind of our big picture scope for what we wanted to see in a municipal code update for the city. Jumping off from that place with that pre-prospectus, we had a series of public meetings. We met with the Infrastructure Planning Sustainability meeting, or committee of the City Council quite a few times, essentially confirming the scope, further defining the scope, asking really important policy questions about how we want to treat trees in the right of way. Ultimately getting to a point where they voted to take the current draft that we had proposed with them to City Council. So we went to study session back on October 31st. That is all of these are, by the way, recorded. So you can visit the city's webpage and see any one of these presentations if you really want to dive in on the progress to date. At that study session meeting, they said, great, let's go ahead. They asked some questions that resulted in a few minor tweaks to the code. And now the next steps are to go to City Council on December 5th, which is next week, for the first reading of the ordinance. Once that is read, the process there is if City Council says, yes, we should come back to have the second reading of the ordinance and the vote on December 12th is when that date would happen, or another date. They may decide that we need a little bit more time to think through potential changes. And then ultimately, once that code is adopted, then it would become effective. We're proposing June 1st of 2024, so that it gives some time for internal training of staff to amend our code process, or our permitting process, so that it reflects the code, to provide a lot of educational outreach opportunities and other things too, to make sure that we're able to implement the changes to this new significantly changed code. Okay, well, that's all the background and history. I'm going to now get into the purpose of the code and then more specifics. So in a general statement here, we can say that the purpose is defined by all that process that I mentioned, is to essentially fix outdated and unclear requirements for the right-of-way specific to trees, right? And again, this is not private property trees we're talking about. I want to be really clear that there's that line. This is just for street rights of way and city-owned property. This is not private property. We also are intending to remove inconsistencies between adopted city policies. I showed some of those on a slide before this, some of those policies that have been adopted, and we want to make sure that we are removing inconsistencies with code. We also want to discourage illegal tree removals. One thing that we heard loud and clear from the community is they're not really sure what's expected of them when they're trying to do actions on trees in the right of way. When does it need a permit? When does it not? What are the triggers? How are those reviewed and administered? And so we want to clarify all that to hopefully ease that process for applicants, so that we don't force people into a situation where they, don't know what they're supposed to do and just take their own actions. We also intend to establish a heritage tree program, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, and to provide processes for individuals to prune trees on city-owned lands as well. And then also to update antiquated violations and penalty structure and other legal terms and things for due process. I always like to mention that a significant portion of this code has not been amended since 1927. So as you can imagine, in almost 100 years' time, a lot has changed. What used to be a significant penalty back then may not be so much today. So part of this is just updating it with the times to make sure that when people do violate, that we have enough teeth, I guess, to make sure that we're able to enforce adequately. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of the specifics. And again, we can, when it comes to the Q&A session, feel free to ask me questions if there's a lack of clarity on these slides. I'm just being brief and truncated for the purpose of this presentation. But specific to street tree pruning, it will be its own separate permit as proposed. So all pruning of street trees requires a permit. Today, actually, that's also the case. But what we're proposing to change is that in order to prune a tree or in order to get that permit to prune a tree, you need to make sure that you're following industry standards, that you're not pruning that tree in a way that makes it a potential hazard for the future, that you're not topping that tree, which again can create structural issues, causing the decline of the tree or a potential hazard. And so you have to essentially apply one of the objectives within the national standards, and then also prune according to those standards as well, kind of in a nutshell. Okay, for removals, again, there already is a required permit for tree removals. We're not proposing to change that, but we are proposing to change the conditions under which you can be approved for those removals. So if you apply for a tree removal permit in the street or in the street right of way, it has to fit one of these categories. So if it's a hazardous tree, a prohibited tree, meaning that maybe it's a species that's known to be invasive here. If it's a significantly damaged tree, a conflict tree, nuisance tree, or fruit tree, all of those are permittable reasons to be able to remove a tree. And there's a special flag there for a conflict tree, which I'll get into in just a minute here. In order to remove that tree, you need to post on that tree 2 weeks public notice, informing the community that you intend to take this tree down, that you're applying for a permit to do so. And you're required to replace that tree. Again, getting back to the value add to the community for having trees in the street right of way, we want to ensure that we're not removing that value by allowing a removal without having to then replace it. All of this is no fee for the permit because again, we want to actually encourage people to remove hazards. We want to encourage people to remove prohibited trees. So we don't want to charge a fee for that, except for conflict trees. So a conflict tree is one that interferes with construction, installation, maintenance, or repair of utilities or right-of-way improvements. It conflicts with development of real property. So if you're developing private property adjacent to the street right-of-way, you might have a need to remove a tree, or one that damages existing improvements within the right-of-way. So if you fall into this conflict tree category, you have to demonstrate that there are no reasonable alternatives to removal. Right? Sometimes you can do bulb outs to save a tree. You can ramp up and over roots, your sidewalk, for instance, right? You can move your utility location in one direction to be able to save a tree. And so you need to demonstrate that you could not avoid those impacts. And then in addition to that, we're proposing what's called a canopy loss fee. Because of that extraordinary value that existing mature tree is providing to the community, and because it's a healthy tree that otherwise would be thriving into the future, but because of your construction, you're proposing to remove it, we are asking that you actually help to offset that canopy loss by paying a fee. And this fee is evaluated based on the existing size of the tree. And that fee would then go to a fund, which then is able to pay for tree planting to offset those impacts elsewhere. We're also proposing, based on some feedback we got from City Council, to make sure that we're providing an equitable process. There's an existing fee reduction portion of a code in the zoning permitting section of the code right now. If you qualify for low income, that you're able to actually reduce your fees. And so that's being applied in this instance as well. Okay, that's for the removals, and then jumping into planting here. So again, permit already required for planting. We're not proposing to change that, but we are saying that in order to plant a tree, we need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's safe and that doesn't damage infrastructure moving into the future. We already have adopted standards for where trees should be planted, the offsets from utilities and pavement and other things as well, making sure that you're enhancing visibility or at least maintaining visibility for safety. And so we ask that when you provide the application for that permit, that you are adhering to all of our standards. So with all of this, again, we're talking about permits here. There are some exemptions, right? And these are things that typically we don't want to make people have to go through a formal permitting process to be able to deal with. So as a for instance, if it's a small tree, maybe a newly planted tree, we recognize that in the first few years after planting, there's some minor structural pruning that would need to occur. We don't want you to have to come for a permit every time. And so small trees are exempt from permits. Same with fruit trees. Fruit trees are pruned in a very specific way on a much more rigorous schedule than typical street trees. And so we also don't require that fruit trees get permits for pruning. As well as for the city or the Department of Transportation, if you're pruning for clearance, let's say clearance over a roadway, clearance over a sidewalk, or for general tree health, those actions are exempt from permits. If utilities are pruning to comply with the electric safety code, so those clearances from high voltage power, for instance, or if you're restoring a downed utility service, right? It's kind of an emergency action. Those are exempt from permits. And then also the city and the DOT, if we're having to remove a tree to abate a threat to public health, like an immediate threat to public health, again, that is not a permitted thing either. Individuals from within the community who have to remove a tree to deal with a hazard, an imminent hazard, right? We ask that you come in for an after the fact permit. The reason for that is we want to make sure that your definition of a hazard is the same as ours, and that the trigger for replanting is by getting a removal permit, right? So we're making sure that if you felt the need to remove a tree to address a hazard, that you also are ensuring that you're replacing the value of that tree. For enforcement, this is kind of an interesting, again, the current code currently states that if you illegally remove a tree in the right of way, it's a $100 fine and 30 days in jail, which I don't think has really kept up with the time since 1927. So we're applying new standards that are more consistent with the industry right now, which essentially is if you illegally remove a tree, whether that's on city real property or in the public right of way, we're assessing a monetary penalty based on the size of that tree. And I mentioned earlier that there's this conflict tree category of fees. And so if you do it illegally, we're saying that you need to pay 3 times the value of that conflict tree's removal if you were to get a permit. If you illegally remove a tree on city property, and as the photo here is an instance, and it has damages to the natural resources or the area, right? Steep slopes that now need erosion control mitigation or other things too. You would also be responsible to pay for the permitting that's required around that, as well as repairing those natural resources damages. One thing that we currently have in the municipal code is a mechanism to allow for individuals within the community to apply to prune trees on city property for the purpose of view enhancement. And we heard from a lot of community members that that's really important to them, is to be able to maintain views from their property, and that we should have a mechanism in place to allow for them to apply. We are not having a permitted process to do that, but we are having an administrative process that's within the code that says that individuals from within the community have the right to request of the city to prune trees for private view enhancement. You can only do so if you're demonstrating that you're minimizing the risk or harm to people or property, preserving and protecting trees and native forest remnants, protecting public property investment. So there's a reason why the city owns this property. If it's an open space, for instance, we're owning it for stormwater management and some other things as well. We want you to not negatively impact the habitat or soils or slope stability, and that you should have a minimal impact on air pollution, noise reduction, water quality, stormwater, and climate impacts. You as the requester, if this is, you're adjacent to city-owned property that's impairing your view from your property, you would have to pay for any permitting costs, administrative costs, and any work to do that, if again, you were approved to take that action. And then lastly here is the heritage tree portion of the ordinance. So essentially what this does is it designates a recognition program called the Heritage Tree Program, where you can nominate any tree located on public property or private property in Tacoma. It can be nominated by any member of the public, but you have to have the consent of the owner of the property. So you can't just, nominate your neighbor's private property tree and put it on a register and call it a day. They actually have to consent to that. And the designation has some criteria to make sure that, it's kind of fitting that exceptional category or that heritage category. But it's really important to be clear here about what that designation means. This is not a tree preservation ordinance. It is a recognition ordinance. So by getting a heritage tree designation, whether it's on public property or your private property, essentially you're putting it on a roster and a map that says, hey, we've got this really great tree in Tacoma that has historic value, has lots of great values based on its size and species and its rarity or whatever the thing is. But it's not a development. It's not a development code. We need to be very clear here because we're talking about right of way and city owned property in this portion of code. It can't be a development regulation. And that's kind of where I want to make sure to split what's happening with this right of way code from what's happening with another project ongoing right now, which is Home in Tacoma. And I'm not here to talk about Home Tacoma. That's a much bigger conversation than we have time for. But that is a zoning code regulation. That is where we're talking about development code, and that is the appropriate place to be talking about tree preservation standards on private property. This code is very separate to that. It's a right-of-way code and city-owned property code. And we're putting in there a heritage tree program as a designation program, again, to put it on a roster and communicate the value of those trees, but it's not a development regulation. There are very different processes in place for adopting development regulations, different public comment criteria. It has to go through the planning commission, lots of different things. And that's a much longer process than this is. So I just, again, being clear that we're not saying no to tree preservation for heritage trees at this point, but that's not in this code package. Okay, next steps. And I'm trying to speak faster because I want to give time for a discussion around this. The next step here is that this upcoming Tuesday, December 5th, we plan to go to the municipal building and speak to council for the first reading of the ordinance. If all goes well and we have the approval to move forward with the second reading, we intend to go right now on December 12th for the second reading, which again, if all goes well, that would be when council would vote on this package and hopefully would go into effect. They may decide that there are changes they want to see made based on public comment or otherwise. So we might come back at a later date. And then if adopted, as I mentioned, the code would go into effect in June of 24 to allow adequate time for training staff, updating our permit system, doing education and outreach, making sure that all the folks in the community understand what these new requirements and expectations are, and creating tip sheets and customer support, and making sure that when people come in for permits, it's very clear what's expected. Okay, that was rapid fire, and that is my spiel. And now I'm happy to take questions. Lowell, if you would like to moderate that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for the overview. Every time I hear this, I hear a little bit different, like detail or something. So it's good to have multiple opportunities. One of the questions that already popped up early on was, do you have a draft text of the ordinance that people can review publicly, or are we still waiting for that to be posted somewhere?
That's a good question. So what currently is public for sure. So we went to the Planning Commission, or excuse me, the Infrastructure Planning and Sustainability Committee of City Council. The date was on one of my slides. Every time we go to one of those committees, they publish the PowerPoint, whatever other documents have been submitted. The last IPS presentation that we went to, we submitted the draft ordinance at that time. Since then, now we've gone to, and so that's publicly available. You can see it on the city's website. Since that time, we've gone to the study session for council, and they have recommended a few changes. And so those changes are now reflected in the code that has been put into the city system, but I do not believe that has been published quite yet. I don't know exactly what that timeline looks like in advance of the council meeting, but it will be published by the time we go to council in the second.
Great, that's helpful. Yeah. So there was a draft that was published a month or two ago when it went to committee, and I can pull that date out and get that to folks. But I just looked at the study session version, and what was available was the recording of the presentation, not the documents. So
Right.
The bottom line is, I think before Tuesday at 5, there will be a link posted on the city council agendas page, and people will be able to review it by then, and hopefully well before then.
And I can touch base with you, Lowell, in advance. As soon as when I hear that has happened, I can touch base with you and make sure to get that out as well.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. And we've got a couple more questions related to land area percentages and things that I think will be interesting for everyone to learn about. So John's question, the first one is, what percentage of land is owned by the city of Tacoma? And what percentage of city-owned land is landscapable to sustain large indigenous trees?
Sorry, I'm not
With
trying to be weird. The
the lights
motion
went up.
sensor lights turned off.
Yep.
Just like I did hear the question, and I am happy to address that.
Yeah.
Um,
So what
actually,
percentage of, you heard the question?
yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, if you go to the City of Tacoma webpage, I think you should be able to just type in cityoftacoma.org/tree canopy, and you'll be directed to a page that has all of our statistics about our tree canopy analysis, where we've broken it into land area. I believe that less than 2% of the city's land area is owned by the city outright. That's public property. So I'm not sure exactly the intent of the question, but I think a question I often get is, hey, if we're wanting to increase tree canopy in Tacoma, why don't we completely plant out all the city property, and will that have an impact? And at the end of the day, the city-owned property, I've already had over the last 10 years here, I've met with most of those property managers and planted a lot of trees where we can. But again, it's such an insignificant amount of the actual land area of Tacoma. It doesn't make a huge dent in tree canopy. And I'm sorry, I might have forgotten or missed the last part of that question.
I think it's kind of just getting to this question of how much opportunity is there for tree planting in the public right of way. And I don't know if you have any more data about maybe not areas the city owns outright, but what's the opportunity look like in the right of way planting space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I'll direct to that webpage because we do have a canopy analysis report that was produced that breaks out all of the land area of Tacoma into land use intensities and watersheds and other things as well. And that's a really good kind of report to review to answer that question. Within that report, and I don't remember all the statistics offhand, so without diving into the website, I can't answer entirely, but that they do break down what's called possible planting area in that report. So for all of those land use intensities, including the right of way, city owned property, parks and recreation areas, single family residential, all those different areas, they break out how much land area it is, how much of that land area is covered in tree canopy, and then how much potential tree planting area is within any one of those land use categories as well. And that's a really good proxy just to see, okay, great, we're at 21% in this category. How much could we increase if we planted it out?
Great, that's super helpful. Yeah, so I just put that link in the chat to the general page, but then I'm also going to try to link to the document, which is a PDF report of the canopy. And there's even more detail in the urban forest management plan and the phase 1 research summary of that. And I have found in one of the appendices there, the land use, like you can see what percentage of the city is parks and open space, what percentage is industrial area, and so on. And then how that correlates with the tree canopy coverage.
Thanks, Lowell.
Great questions, John. All right. John has another question. What's the deadline for public comment to council? And I was looking this up last night, and I can tell you that if you want to submit a written comment, it needs to be done within 24 hours, 24 hours prior to the start of the meeting. So that would be Monday at 5 o'clock. And if you want to give a comment verbally, you can do so in person at the city hall, or you can do it on Zoom, but there's a process for registering and signing up for that. So I would say the start of the meeting would be the best time to get in line to give a comment on the tree ordinance. Does that track with what you understand, Mike?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Thanks, Lowell.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question from Deb. Heritage tree nomination must be for trees over 30 inches. DBH, I think is what they're saying. And the comment is that seems very restrictive. So is that correct?
Yeah, and I'll have to go back. I already turned off the slide deck here, but what I will say is that the intent of that, again, is to designate the tree as a significant tree that likely wouldn't be found elsewhere frequently, right? And so we had to establish a threshold. That 30-inch diameter is a threshold that is pretty typical of heritage tree programs kind of across the region. And that's how that number was set. And again, it's a nomination program at the end of the day, right? It's not to say that you can't publicly recognize your trees in other ways. But part of this too is to recognize that when these nominations come in, and it does take a significant amount of staff time to visit the site and ensure that it meets the requirements of a heritage tree, to put it into our system, to do all the back end work as well to designate the tree and recognize it. And so if we're allowing any tree over 8 inches, let's say, that'd be a lot of trees coming in. So we just need to be conscious of staff time it takes for that too.
Thanks a lot. And I think, was there not a note in your slide about a certain species that are smaller that are also significant?
Yeah, I'm gonna pull back up that slide really quick because you are correct. And I'm forgetting the exact language at the moment, but I will.
I happened to be down in Portland the other day and I saw a similar, like a heritage tree on at a park, and it was a Stewardia. So it was like 100-year-old Stewardia. So a smaller species. It wasn't 30 inches wide, but it was still significant because it's the largest of its kind in the city. So are you also accounting for that?
Yeah, so the language in there is that it's a minimum of 30-inch in diameter or 65% of the largest documented size for that species in Washington state. And so there's a manual that's put out there, and it's, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name. It's by Pete Van Pelt, and it's essentially the heritage trees of Washington state. And again, I'm forgetting the exact title, but that's kind of the book where Pete has gone throughout Washington state and looked at some of the reported biggest species or biggest sizes of trees of that any particular species. And that's kind of the industry trend for Washington state of what's the largest documented size. So if you have a tree that meets 65% of any one of those trees in that book, that's kind of what would also trigger, even if it's less than 30 inches.
Awesome. Yeah, I think once the Heritage Tree Program is approved, we're going to have lots more questions. And I think it'll be a really great way for people to get involved and celebrate the big trees that we have across Tacoma. So we might table more of that discussion until a later time. Jeannie has a question, which I think is kind of short, and that's just, what is the public right of way? Are all parking strips, whether in front of private or public property, in the right of way?
That's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. I oftentimes don't spend enough time explaining that, so thank you. So the public right of way is any area that's outside of parcel property, so outside of private ownership. And we actually, again, on the city's urban forestry webpage, we do have kind of a what is the right of way page, and it kind of walks you through the process to figure out where is your right of way specifically. There's a couple city mapping systems, one of which is linked on that page, but it'll specifically take you up to a city map. You can type in your address of the area that you're interested in, and there are lines on that map that kind of designate what's right of way versus what's private property. And it's kind of the best way to figure it out. It means different
Yes.
things in different neighborhoods. Sometimes there's no sidewalk, sometimes there's no planting strip, sometimes the street is different, sometimes it's 10 feet back from sidewalk, sometimes it's 5. It's very specific to your neighborhood.
Great, thanks. And I just put in the chat the link to that webpage about what the right of way is.
Thanks, Lowell.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip ahead. I think there's a lot of questions. Thank you all. Keep them coming. We'll handle as many as we can before the 1 o'clock end time. Tia has a question. After reading about the recent change in the hardiness map by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I'm curious about if the changing of climate itself in Washington and how much planning has gone into determining which street trees will be most sustainable with significant warming. Has there been foresight into our usual options for street trees and if they're appropriate or not? So what do you think about the changing climate and our tree choices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, it's something that I think we've all been struggling with in this industry. We're getting more extremes in heat. Even our establishment periods are changing. For instance, we kind of as a standard will have 3 years that we water trees typically. And after that time, we hope the trees are established enough to fend for themselves. And because of these extremes that we've been getting, it's really hard to anticipate kind of how to, it's a moving target, right? It's hard to anticipate what changes we need to make. There is some research that's been published recently specific to Washington state that talks a little bit about trees that are known to adapt well to the variation in conditions. That list is something that we're taking a look at specifically, yeah, at the city. And we have a pre-approved street tree list, and we're using that. And we're constantly reevaluating that list and seeing if there are species we should pull off, new species to put on. But yeah, it's something that honestly only time will tell. We're hoping to, with our mapping system that we have online, which is called Tree Plotter. It's how we map all of our trees and city plants. We're hoping to be able to go back and reevaluate previously planted trees and see what their success rates are for any given species and hopefully make changes to adapt.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot too, and I've started to even describe the street, the right-of-way area as a slightly different microclimate from backyards. If we think about backyards that have a lot of shade, they can differ in temperature quite a bit from the front yard and the street area where the street is trapping heat and so on. So it matters what type of species we have and whether they're drought tolerant and things like that. Thanks, Tia. So a couple questions here related to the incentive side of things and like incentives for planting. So one comment is from Kevin in British Columbia. Our heritage tree program includes a carrot for allowing designation on private property, grants toward proactive maintenance to help ensure ongoing tree health. And Kevin's saying that that's probably unusual, but it's a nice incentive in that community. So thanks for that comment. And then Bruce says, I hear fines or permits with fees required to remove trees. Was there a discussion of any incentives to plant more trees other than the free tree programs already in place? So I guess I would rephrase that and say, like, does the code that you're talking about apply to planting incentives, or does it just apply to kind of penalties or that permitting process?
Just to make sure that I understand fully, so any tree planting, pruning, or removal, except for the exemption list that I have on that slide, requires a permit. And I guess is the question, are we incentivizing tree planting by removing permits or reducing permits, or are we paying? So it's free to get a tree planting permit, and so I'm trying to understand what the ask is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this strikes me as a issue that's more related to like programming. Like mostly incentives happen on the program side where like our community tree program with partnership with the Tree Foundation and the city, we give free trees and we offer planting assistance in some cases, and those can be the incentives that we offer people. But I think it would be rare to have it in the code where it's like some
Yeah.
kind of monetary incentive, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, the when someone participates in one of those programs where it's a partnership between the city and the Tree Foundation, like our free street tree programs, the city actually applies for the permits on the owner's behalf. So I guess
Hmm.
to get back to the incentive conversation, that's a hurdle that the owner doesn't have to go through if you participate in one of our programs. We actually provide all of your information and get the permits so you don't have to.
Yeah, great point. So hopefully that answers that question. And a question from Anna. I think you stated that the proposal would allow fruit trees in the right of way. Is that right? Can you go over the other requirements in order to plant a fruit tree along the sidewalk?
That's a great question. So currently in municipal code, we do not allow for fruit trees to be planted in the public right of way. It's currently on the prohibited tree list. And the reason, there's a lot of history there, but one of the reasons is essentially that there's not a good mechanism to require people to provide enough maintenance on those fruit trees to ensure public safety. So what we have been asked to do is to consider removing fruit tree prohibitions, which we've done in this current draft code, but then to couple it with other links to other programs, like Pierce Conservation District has a fruit tree gleaning program. And so by connecting people through the permitting process, if someone comes in to get a permit for fruit trees, we will send them resources to ensure that they can adequately select the tree that's right for that site. So there's a pre-approved tree list for fruit trees now, which are going to be small enough dwarf fruit trees, so you don't have to have specialized equipment to climb tall into the tree, but you can access all the fruit gleaning from the ground. We'll also provide connections to the gleaning program at Pierce Conservation District so that if you can't glean all the fruit yourself, that you have access to resources for someone who can. So we're kind of going the carrot side, if you will, instead of the stick for fruit trees now.
That's great. And I would just say, this is something that we hear about at the Tree Foundation a lot from community members. People want to be able to grow food at home. Having a fruit tree in the right of way is something that a lot of people are interested in. And so it seems like an important step toward food justice in the community and just being more resilient in general as a community. And I love that we hear that from people all the time. So it's important to know that fruit trees have their own special considerations and ways of maintaining and caring for them. But it is exciting to hear that the city's legalizing it and then offering resources too.
When we did, I mentioned the urban forest management plan process that had 2 years of public engagement, and that was one of the top things that the community members spoke about was wanting to be able to plant fruit trees or food producing trees in the right of way. So,
All right, Georgette has a question. Is the long-term goal of Tacoma's urban forestry department to have the city, rather than the homeowner, take full responsibility for trees in the right of way? Is this the way that is done in many other cities?
that's a really big question. What I can tell you is that the city council has adopted the urban forest management plan, which has policy in there about long-term goals for taking over some level of care for trees. And it starts with in the urban forest management plan specifically calls out there's some designated corridors where there are significant trees of great value to the community that need some TLC. And it asks that the city take some level of responsibility for maintaining those. I cannot speak to other policies in terms of what the city wants to do or long-term transition goals because city council would have to set those policies. If the city council decided we want to take over right-of-way tree responsibility, they have the authority to do so, but I can't speak as a staff person what their intent is. Sorry if that didn't answer the question, but that's maybe as much as I can go with where I'm at.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I can add is that as part of this work we're doing on local tree policies in Pierce County, I know that there are jurisdictions in Pierce County that do take responsibility for the right of way. And one of those examples is Fircrest. So in Fircrest, all the street trees are cared for by the city staff. Now it's a much smaller area and less challenging in that way. There's also a middle ground. I think Lakewood is doing this, where if the city plants a tree in the public right of way, the city then commits to taking care of that tree. So I think there's many different ways to parse this, and I do think that although big cities in the region are generally not taking care of street trees, small cities are maybe more able to do that, but personally, I think it's something that would be a great step that we could push for more government responsibility for maintaining and caring for trees in the right of way. There's a lot of good questions here. I'm not sure we can get to all of them. There's a question here from Raisa. Is there a plan for outreach on this? And I guess this means the street tree ordinance to be in multilingual material. Many of these heat islands are in neighborhoods with immigrant populations. What do you think about multilingual outreach related to the tree codes?
That's a really great question. And we haven't fully developed what the communication plan is going to be. And so far, again, we kind of have that 6 month lag period between when it's adopted and when it is enacted to really flesh that out, what that is going to look like. I really appreciate that point about access, language access to a lot of our communication materials. And at the city, we've been working with, and specifically in urban forestry as well, we've been working with a program for language ambassadors who help to transcreate materials and help with communication with community members too that are not English as a first language speaking. And so that's definitely on our sites. That's where we would love to get, and we'll definitely work on creating materials that we can translate into some of those top most spoken languages in Tacoma.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's been an area that we're really excited about seeing advancement in our tree partnership. At our branch out event this month we had at least 10 families who did not speak English as a first language come to our event and receive help from those language ambassadors. So that was a great accomplishment, but it's something that we need to keep working on. I think maybe one last question here from Pamela. When will the city make landscaping businesses follow proper pruning practices on trees to protect canopies?
That's a good question. I think I'll probably narrow that down a little bit because again, this code in particular is about the right of way. And so we don't have a whole lot of control over what individual property owners do with their landscaping companies at this time on their trees. But for the public right of way, as I mentioned in the code in the PowerPoint slide, in order to prune a tree in the right of way, you have to comply with industry standards for pruning. And so those landscaping companies would be obligated to do so. And again, if they do not comply with the conditions of their permit, they'd be in a violation of a permit, which then is subject to those fees and fines that I talked about in a different slide.
Yeah, great. I will also add that this is an option that cities can do. In Seattle, landscaping companies do need to go through a training in order to conduct work within the city limits. And again, I think that's probably a great step for cities to take, but not currently something that's happening in Tacoma. We're running a little short on time. I have one more question for you, Mike, and then I want to do like a quick 2-minute farewell. So we might go just a couple minutes past 1. But my question is going back to like the big picture here. I know that these code updates that are proposed are not exactly tree preservation, right? It doesn't mean that trees will not get cut down in Tacoma. So why is this important? Or are trees going to be more protected than they currently are in the right of way after this passes?
That's a really good question. And the short answer is yes. So currently, the municipal code states that if you want to remove a tree in the city right of way, you have to obtain a permit. And the only conditions for the city to deny that permit is if you're ruining the symmetry of a tree. That's all that's in the code. It says if you're pruning that tree or removing that tree results in ruining the symmetry of that tree, then we have the authority to deny you the permit. And as you can imagine, that's really subjective. It's really hard to enforce. And again, the fees for violations are so de minimis that it doesn't really even cover staff time to pursue any of those violations. So right now, effectively, most anybody could come in to get a street tree removal permit most days of the week, right? There's very little protection in place. This new code says all of these actions, you need a permit, and it applies conditions for those things, right? So it has to qualify as a hazard or a nuisance tree or one that's prohibited, right? I think some of this gets back to a lot of the tree protection or removal is going to come through this category of conflict trees, right? So I want to build my property out. And so in doing so, I'm going to have new utilities that are going to impact existing trees. And that's when you cross that threshold of the conflict tree. And the hope is that by having that fee assigned to conflict tree removal, it'll force people to start considering, can I avoid tree impacts? So right now, I think it's just easiest for when properties get developed for someone to come through and cut down all the trees first because they're in the way and I'd like to build my building, I'd like to do my thing first, and then I'll plant some trees in after. That the intent of that fee is very clearly to force people to consider, can I preserve that tree? Because if I can't preserve it, then I'm going to have to pay a fee, and it's not going to be fun. So hopefully we'll see more trees preserved just by way of assessing that fee than we currently do.
Yeah, great. And I think I've also heard you say that by updating a century-old tree code, it'll actually make it more enforceable, like from a legal standpoint. Is that
Absolutely,
true?
yeah, that was a primary objective of this whole code is to allow for legally defensible mechanism to enforce the code, to have adequate fees and violations so that it actually covers staff time to pursue violations, to basically be able to physically administer the code.
That's great. And I think too, it makes me think that in the future, hopefully when a tree is removed in the right of way, we as residents will be able to look up whether a permit was obtained for that tree removal. And if not, report it to the city's channels so that the city could then follow up and apply the fee. Is that about how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, actually, so you can do that right now. So if people are concerned about trees coming down in the street right of way, maybe it has a permit, maybe it doesn't. If you go to the city's Tacoma First 311 system. So it's either a phone call or online. You can ask that question: was there a permit obtained for removal of this tree? And if there wasn't, that's also the mechanism then that you can file a formal complaint about a tree removal without a permit.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I want to close just by saying this is slated to go in front of City Council next week for the first reading, and these are these are code changes that we've been waiting for generations in Tacoma. So um, I am personally in support of the proposed changes, and we would love to see a lot of people go out to City Council to share public comments. Email your comments in to do that civic engagement and tell your leaders what you think about these proposed changes. Um, it seems like a really important first step to getting better tree protections in Tacoma and having a more resilient urban forest. So thank you, Mike, and to all your team and colleagues who have worked on this over the past 10 years or so, and definitely in the last few months.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lowell. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I just want to close with a couple final things. As always, we have events coming up in at the Tree Foundation, and two of those events are coming up soon. One is related to pruning. We're actually doing a workshop on structural pruning basics. This is on Wednesday, the 13th at 5:30 on Zoom. And the idea here is for people that have had a tree that's now a couple years old, you've had it in the ground, it's watered, it's healthy. How do you prune it in such a way that sets it up for future success? And so Sarah Lowe is going to be leading this online workshop to understand how you can do some basic pruning when your trees are 3 to 5 years old. We also have an event coming up next Thursday, an ode to the trees of Tacoma. And this is going to be a really cool event at Blue Cactus Press at their new office at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And Blue Cactus is going to help us with this bilingual literary exploration in English and Spanish with Wendy Call. And so we're really excited about this event and hope a lot of you can join us. This is also setting up a partnership that we have with Northwest Sinfonietta. They are also a Tacoma Creates funding recipient. And we've got, we'll have more details about a Tacoma Tree Foundation involvement at one of the Sinfonietta's concerts in early 2024. So we're really excited about both those things. As always, if you have questions, you can contact us at info@tacomatreefoundation.org. Follow us on social media. And I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, and I'm sorry about that, but if you send us an email, we can help to get you the answer to your question. So thanks to everyone. It's great to see all of you, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.